Hi, I'm Mara Bascujlaky, and I'm the Sustainable Communities Agent at the Cooperative Extension Service at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. There's still snow on my deck and quite a lot of snow in my garden, but it's that time of year to start seeds. Starting seeds at home is very economical. It's a lot of fun and it's a great family activity. The best part of doing it, though, is that in the summer when you're eating those tasty vegetables and enjoying the pretty flowers, you know that you've started those plants from the very beginning, from when they were little tiny seeds, all the way up to when you're enjoying those fresh beans and cabbage. So let's go inside now and see how it's done and get started. Now that you've decided to try growing seeds at home and you've ordered your seeds and they've arrived, the first step before we start planting anything is to decide what needs to get planted when. Different things grow at different rates, and you'll be starting them according to when your last frost date is where you live, and that you're looking at a time frame between about mid-March for slow, early growing varieties to about the end of April, early May. Having done this, even though I've done this for about 15 years, I can never remember from year to year when I need to start what. So I have a book and some cheat sheets that I use every year. So what I normally do is about mid-March, I sit down one quiet afternoon and I sort my seeds according to which week I need to start them. And this is my garden book. You don't need to have something as big or as pulled together as this. You can just keep notes, jot them down year to year. But it's a good idea because things do vary according to where you live. And some places you even have microclimates within your own garden. And it's a good way to keep track of what grows well, where, and when you started it. There's a couple ways that you can help figure out when to start your seeds. The Cooperative Extension has a pretty good publication that gives different weeks of starting ahead of when you're going to set them out for flowers and vegetables, and I tend to use that. It doesn't give all your varieties, though, and then there's some others that have occasionally showed up in the newspaper, and what I do is when I find them and I like them and they work well for me, I cut them and I put them in my garden book, and then each year I can go back and refer to them. And then also, finally, I keep notes for each year of when I've started different varieties and if it worked or not, you know, in the sense of that maybe they were too big by the time I needed to set them out, or maybe they were too small and actually never ended up flowering or fruiting by the time our frost came. So if you have a plant or a variety that you want to grow that doesn't show up in any of the kind of commercial records that you have or ones that you've kept in the past, you can also figure it out yourself. On each packet of seeds, they always tell you how many days it is to production. And actually, you will have already looked at this number when you order your seeds, because for Alaska, we have a fairly short growing season. And you'll want to get varieties that produce in a fairly short period of time. So let's look at cabbage here. On this packet, it says 66 days. And the way that you figure this out is you're going to look at when you sort of want to have your cabbage. And generally, we'll say beginning of July. And you're going to take 66 and divide it by 30 for the amount of days in a month on average, and you get about 2 months, a little more than 2 months. So if you want to have your cabbages ready in about July, beginning of July, you just count back, and so that would be June and the beginning of May. Add on a couple of extra weeks for good measure. So you're looking at starting your cabbages in mid-April. For something that takes a lot longer to grow, we have here a pumpkin, and that takes 105 days. And so you do the same thing again, 105 divided by 30, and there you get 3.5 months. So you see there, you're going to be looking at probably getting your pumpkins. You want to get them harvestable before the first killing frost. And in Fairbanks now, we're looking at anywhere from about mid-August to mid-September. So I want to have my pumpkins pretty much on the vine by, say, mid-August at the latest. So I count back from that, and again, I'll get a planting date of about April 15th to April 22nd. Pumpkins grow pretty quickly, and so I kind of balance that, because if you start them too soon, they're going to be too big in their pots before they're ready to set out, and that can affect their health. So another thing that you want to pay attention to when you're sitting down to plan your seed starting schedule is when your last date of frost is, when you can safely set your plants out. Here in Fairbanks, we have a standard June 1st setting out date, And so all of our schedules that I use are pretty much for that time. If you're in an area where your last frost is more like the second week of June, then you'll want to start your plants about that much later, a week or two later than what most of the schedules will say. So once I do that, I've sorted my seeds, and then also the other important thing is to take out any of the seeds that you can directly plant right into the garden. You don't want to waste your precious indoor growing space with plants that can actually start right in the garden. And also, more importantly, your root crops, you don't transplant. They want to be directly seeded where they're going to grow, and those include things like your turnips, onions, carrots, peas will germinate very well in cold soil, so they can be planted almost as soon as you can work the soil. And lettuce also grows very quickly, so I don't usually waste indoor space on those things, and I keep them set aside so that I remember that I need to start planting those. Usually here in Fairbanks, I can start planting them outside in mid-May. So now that I know what I'm going to plant when, let's go and plant some seeds. Okay, now that we've discussed a little bit about how to figure out your planting schedule and when you're going to start your seeds relative to when your last frost date is where you live and when you're going to be setting out your plants, let's look at some of the equipment that you will need to raise healthy starts. I've developed this sort of system for myself based over about 16 or 17 years of doing this and living in pretty small cabins, ones that didn't have a lot of room or running water, for instance, and tried to find a setup where I could grow a good variety of plants for my garden in a relatively small amount of space. You can certainly use windowsills and shelves below your windowsills, and I've done that in the past, but one of the key things to getting very healthy starts is that they need intense light. And so the reason I have invested in this kind of setup is it allows me to do that very cheaply without having a greenhouse or some of these fancy grow shelves that are sold at, in garden catalogs. What I use here is a wire utility shelf that you can get at any home improvement store. This particular model I really like because it came with the option of having wheels. And I decided to do this, and I'm going to be trying this for the first time this year. I can actually roll it outside to my deck, and when I have this all filled with plants, when it's time to harden them off, this will be a really nice time-saving and effort-saving feature that I can just roll the whole shelf outside and then inside in the evenings. I have shop lights here as the grow lights, and the shelves are deep enough that you can put 2 per shelf. Eventually I will add down here and probably on the ceiling so I have more room. You don't need to invest in expensive grow lights. These are just straight fluorescent fixtures. The key thing is that you always will keep the fixtures within 2 to 3 inches of the plant. That's the most important thing. Another reason I like the metal utility shelves is because I use chain with small hooks, and this allows me to easily raise and lower the lights as my plants grow. The other thing that I've added is a timer so that I don't have to remember to turn on and off my lights, and I set it when my seeds are starting for about 12 to 16 hours so that they get an intense light. If electricity and the cost of it is a concern where you're living, as it is getting increasingly, you can do less hours. You can probably do 8 to 12, and you'll still have very good healthy plants. The only other thing that you'll also need is, of course, a power strip, because you're going to be plugging in up to 8 lights at a time. In terms of the actual equipment you need for your seeds, anything that holds soil works. You can use recycled plastic bins from things that you get in the supermarket, yogurt cups, cottage cheese cups, margarine tubs, juice boxes. The most important thing if you're using recycled objects is to punch holes in the bottom so water can drain out. This here is considered to be commercial store-bought seed setup. I like these quite a lot after using home recycled things because it allows me to really pack my shelves with a lot of different starters. It keeps plants in a good arrangement. It allows a lot of airflow, and you can do different sizes according to your seeds needs. These are 4 packs. These are 6-packs, which is pretty much what all commercial greenhouses use. These are 6-inch pots that you can use smaller pots. And it's important, sometimes you're going to have to be using these types versus the cells because large, robust plants like tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, squash grow very quickly. They have a very heavy root system and they don't like to be transplanted at all. So what you want to do is pretty much put your seed in, leave them in this pot until they're going to be set out in either your greenhouse or your garden. These are good for things like marigolds, petunias, cabbage, broccoli, smaller seedlings that don't grow such a robust root system right off the bat. You'll also need a way to label your seeds. You can use popsicle sticks or markers like this, and you can just stick them in your pot. My favorite to use is masking tape and a permanent marker. It's cheap, fast, and I can label the individual pots or I can label the trays. Another very important thing is to have an under tray. You'll be putting your pots in, whether it's your 6-packs or even your recycled containers. You want to make sure that this tray does not leak. You hold it up to the light, make sure you don't have any holes because you'll be putting above lights and you're going to be watering a lot and you don't want to mix your water and electricity. You can also use old things like old cookie sheets, anything like that. Trays like this. Finally, you'll also need, of course, your seeds, which you can purchase at places like grocery stores or greenhouses in town, or you can get through mail. There's lots of different seed catalogs, particularly the northern nurseries or seed growers have a lot of varieties that are very good for Alaska, and you can order online or you can order through the mail. One other thing I should mention, of course, is soil, and I use both types, both a potting soil mix and what is called a seed starting mix. And seed starting mix is a much lighter medium. It has a lot of vermiculite in it, which is a type of mica that retains water. And this is very important for young, when you're starting your seeds, because you don't want your seeds to dry out as they're germinating, or it will kill the plant. Potting soil has more peat and sand in it, and is actually what you'd be using to plant your house plants in. I like to use this in your 6-inch pots when you're planting things like tomatoes and cucumbers that are going to stay in place from the time you plant them to when you put them outside. The seed starting mix is more for smaller seeds that really don't need a whole lot of support or don't have a big root system. So, but it's sometimes personal preference, and people have different likes for what type of soil mixture. And we'll talk more about that when we actually plant the seeds. So now that we have our seeds, which we've sorted according to when you want to plant them and also the size of the seed, we can start actually planting seeds. Now that we have our seed equipment identified and set up, let's plant some seeds. Today I'm going to plant a few vegetables and a couple of different flower varieties. As I mentioned before, it's important before you start to read your seed packs thoroughly and to sort of sort your seeds by the size and the depth that they're going to be planted, because this enables you to make your seed cells, the soil level in them, the correct planting depth. And it just makes things a lot easier for you when you're working on these things. It also determines what kind of container you're going to use. If you have a big seed, I'm going to plant some beans today, and these, as you can see, are very large seeds. And if you kind of go by seed size, you can tell that putting a seed that's this size into a 6-cell pretty much indicates that your plant's not going to have enough time or enough room, to grow. If you remember, your plants are going to be spending about 6 to 8 weeks in these containers before you set them outside. So today I'm going to put the beans into these containers, and I'm going to use a potting soil there because these plants need a lot. They grow quickly, they like to have a lot of organic material, and they're just happier growing in potting soil. In these I'm going to put the seed starting mix because it's light and fluffy, and I'm using slightly smaller seeds, and generally they'll do better in a lighter mix. I also want to point out that you can use your garden soil. It is not necessary to buy commercial products. You can go out and dig out soil from your garden. You'll want to make sure it's warm and pretty dry, because right now it's breakup and it's probably waterlogged. So if you are going to use your garden soil, you'll want to plan ahead of time and have your soil indoors and ready to be planted. And that should be that it's not soaking wet or cold. So what I do is, let's start with the 6 packs. I take my seed starting mix or whatever I'm going to use, and I just fill up the cells with the soil. I try to keep the mess down as much as possible, so I don't have too much cleanup when I'm done with all of this. And I just dump a bunch on top and spread it out over the cells. Of course, they've been put inside of their leak-proof tray. That helps hold them together, and it also keeps the whatever soil might fall through from going all over the place. And I just spread it out, trying to get all the soil into all of the cells, and then I just top them off by hand and make sure that every cell has some soil. And because this stuff is very light and fluffy, you're going to want to push down and compress in each cell. This is something you need to do a little bit gently, because these cells are pretty fragile plastic, and if you press too hard, you will press out the bottom and all your soil will fall down into your tray. So, as I've found from experience. So I just go through and initially push the soil down into all of the 6-pack cells, and then like you see here, I'm missing a lot of soil, so I just top it off. It's not a very precise science. And when I think that I have enough, you'll see here it looks like it's filled to the top. This is what your level is going to be once you put in your seeds, but of course if you have seeds that you want to plant at a 1/2 inch, this is looks like it's too high. But really what we're going to do is, you'll see as we water it, it's going to compress. And therefore, you're actually going to end up needing to probably add a little bit more before you actually plant the seeds. So now I'm going to just do one last compression, make sure I have enough soil in there. I'm also paying attention to the fact that I'm planting a couple of different types, sizes of seeds. Here I'm going to be putting some 1/2 inch seeds that want to be planted at a 1/2 inch depth, and here 1/8 of an inch. So I just want to keep that in mind so that I have the proper planting depth. The next step that you're going to do after you fill these up with soil or seed starting mix is you're going to water the soil, and you're going to let this sit for about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on how long it takes for all of these cells to take up water. And what I do is I fill it from the bottom, take out one of these cells, and I put in about a 1/4 inch to about 1/3 of an inch of water. And you want this on a level surface so that the water distributes throughout the tray, and it will be soaked up by all of the seed cells. And this takes, like I said, anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. So I do a tray at a time, and then when I'm done, I just set it aside. Or in this case, I'm going to set this on top while it soaks up, and I'm going to put my soil in these pots. For these, as I mentioned, I'm going to be using potting soil, so I switch out. And again, just like I did with the others, basically I'm just going to fill these up with soil. Potting soil is a little bit easier to work with. It compacts pretty quickly. And although I also pre-water it, it's not as necessary to pre-water as seed starting mixes. And here I'm going to use a couple of recycled yogurt containers for my beans. And in this case, the beans are going to need to be planted at about a 1/2 inch depth. So again, I'm going to press this down pretty good. You want to be on a firm surface because, as you can see, if you don't, you can't get it compressed well. And it doesn't have to be precise. It could roughly estimate a 1/2 inch. So something like that. And then these will be ready to plant the beans. Now, normally I would put these into a tray and bottom water them, but you can also, when you have bigger pots like this, it is possible to do it from the top. You just want to be careful that it doesn't overflow and make a mess everywhere, but essentially just a little bit of water to moisten the soil, and also it draws out any air, it compacts the soil, and you want to really make sure that you have as much soil in there as you can accommodate, because as you'll see, as the plants grow, they're going to need all of the room that they can get. So you want to start your plant really up close to the top of your container. And then we'll just let that sit for a little bit and wait while the water gets soaked up in our seed starting medium here, and we'll be back in about 20 minutes. Okay, now we're going to actually plant. The soil's ready, and it's got right sort of moisture. It's a good level from the bottom or from the top of the container, and let's plant some beans in these 4 containers. What I usually do before I plant is I want to get my labels ready, and in this case I'm going to just use these stakes, so I just basically write down what it is. You can put down just simply that it's beans, or if you're growing several different types of varieties, you might want to note the variety. But I'll have 4 labels ready that will tell me what it is that I'm going to be planting, and then I'm ready to put the seeds in. When you're planting things, even though you're going to end up with 1 plant per pot, you want to plant more than 1 seed in case you have a germination failure. Also, you're going to be picking from the 2 seedlings that eventually sprout the plant that looks the healthiest and the most robust. So in this case, I'm planting 2 per container, and I like to press them down a bit into the soil. It helps root them, especially when you're watering. It's not such a big issue for big seeds like this because they're pretty massive seeds, but for smaller seeds sometimes it makes a difference. So I just put the seeds in like that, and beans like to be planted about a 1/2 inch to even 1 inch. So is often the better depth. And I put in the seeds, and then I just cover them up with potting soil in this case. When I'm planting a bunch of pots or cells, I like to plant all the seeds and then do all the covering, because as you'll see when you're using or planting smaller seeds, sometimes you can't see if you've put seeds in. So I like to do all one thing at once in steps so that I don't get confused, because that often happens with me. So you want to lightly tamp down the soil in this case, because the seeds are big and you won't be disturbing anything. And again, these are seeds that need to be covered for germination, so you want to make sure you have a good firm pack on it. And then you stick in your labels so that you know what you've grown, like so. You could also, of course, in this case, have just labeled them with masking tape, whatever works for you. And then I usually add just a little bit of water. Now your soil has already been pre-moistened, so really it's not very much. It's just a little bit on top. And again, I only do top watering in this case because these are large seeds and they won't get washed away or disturbed by watering. Generally though, you'll always want to be watering from the bottom. Or you can alternatively use a spray. That is another way to moisten the top layer of soil that you just put on without doing a lot of movement that might wash away your seeds, as you would with top watering. And in this case, I'm going to use Saran wrap to seal these up and keep the moisture in. Some people use newspaper, and that's also okay, but you want to make sure that if you do, you're not using it on seeds that need light to germinate. And in this case, beans are covered, so you could use newspaper, but I prefer Saran wrap or the commercial plastic domes. And then I'll just move these over and put them under the lights and tuck it in. The idea behind the Saran wrap is that you're just creating a little mini hothouse to keep the moisture in and keep your seeds from drying. Then next I'm going to do this flat of 6 packs. This is about half an hour later, and as you can see, the water has soaked up from the bottom, and this is about how you want your seed starting mixture to look. It's turned a dark brown, and when you press on it, you're not squishing any water up, but it is moist, and as you can see, as the water absorbed, some of the cells that looked very full before have actually really shrunk below the level. So you might want to top it off. At this point, before I add any more, I decide how I'm going to plant. And here I have lettuce and peppers that need to be planted at a depth of 1/4 inch. So I'm going to look at these cells and I'm going to make sure that I have ones that are just about 1/4 inch. And these look good. So I decide I'm going to put peppers there. And then this is going to be for my lettuce. So I'm going to do 2, so that's 12 plants of lettuce, 12 plants of peppers. Marigolds need 1/4 inch also, so I'm going to prepare this. And I just sort of tap it down. You want to make sure that the soil is firm, then you don't have too much airspace in there. That's going to be my marigolds. Then I have cabbage, which likes actually 1/2 inch. Now you'll see here these cells are quite a bit deeper in the soil, so I'm going to put the cabbage there. And then finally I have this type of flower that's a very tiny seed, and it likes to be only covered with 1/8 inch of potting mix, which is essentially just a dusting. So you'll see this is a little bit too low here. So what I'm going to do is just top it off a little bit with my seed starting mix. And it's okay if that's dry right now. You're going to moisten it, but I'm going to bring that up to almost the top because 1/8 inch is very, very little cover. And now these are ready to be planted. I've already labeled them, and the way that I did it is since I'm going to be moving the cells around under the lights inside the trays, I decided that I'm going to label it by putting masking tape on each individual cell. So those are already labeled, and now we're going to first do peppers. And actually, as it turns out, I only have enough peppers to do 6, so I'm going to just only plant 1 6-pack. And as you can see, these are pretty flat, small, not so small seeds, but they're flat. And again, just like with the beans, you're going to want to put about 2 per cell. You're going to thin those later. They do sell special tools that suck up the seeds, and you can blow them in very carefully. And I've tried those sometimes, but I didn't have much success with them. So I just used my fingers. And it doesn't matter if you get more than a couple in there. You're going to thin these later. And actually it does look like I have enough to do 12 plants, so I'm going to put, again, 2 more in here. Or per 6-pack. And that's it for the peppers. I'm not going to cover these yet. I'm just going to plant everything first. So let's do lettuce next. And this is also, again, a seed. These are slightly smaller, as you can see, than the pepper seeds. And these are going to be a little harder to control. So again, I just sort of do a little sprinkle. You might get 3, you might get 4 seeds. It really doesn't matter. You're going to thin them. And the idea is just to get more than 1 in there. And you try to put them in the center. So that when you thin it down to 1 plant, it's right in the middle and it has the most room to grow. So I did 12 of lettuce, and then I'm going to do some marigolds. These, as you can see, are an even different seed. They are long and pretty easy to handle, so that's very easy to just put 1 or 2 per, actually I'm sorry, 2 per cell. I like handling big seeds like this because it's a lot easier than those tiny, tiny seeds. And if you keep your fingers relatively dry at this point, it's easy to drop the seeds off of them. If your hands get too wet or you get too much soil clinging to them, you'll find it's really tough to let go, to leave the seed where you want it. And then I just usually go back and make sure that I've gotten at least 2 per container. This one is the one that is going to be covered with just a fine dusting of seed starter. So, and again, some of these seeds it's really hard to get just 2 or 3, so I just put in, I try to be fairly conservative because you can always save your seeds for next year. They do last a couple of years, and you don't need to just overplant it because you're just going to be thinning them. And then finally we're going to do the cabbage, and this is a more round, robust seed. As you see, they're a little bit bigger, and those go to 1/2 inch. So I put them in the deepest containers, and again, they're pretty easy to do because you can actually see and feel them. And then now we're ready to cover it all up with soil. And for this, again, I just usually grab handfuls and I sprinkle it over, paying kind of attention to the fact that this one needs a 1/2 inch of cover, while this just needs a dusting. So then I'll just go very lightly. If you have some concern about it, you can also, of course, take out the cells and do it separately, but it doesn't really take too much to figure out which ones need a bit more soil. These are the 1/4 inch ones, and then I just very gently kind of smooth it out. You want to be careful that you don't disturb the seeds. And everybody gets covered up. They're already labeled. And then I just very gently tap it down. And again, there might be some cases where you're going to be putting seed directly on top and not covering it because they need light to germinate. Those you're not going to want to touch at all because you're going to pick them up on your hands. So if I have seeds like that, I try to put them all into one cell, one flat. All the seeds that need light, because it's just easier for me to plant them. But that's really your own personal choice. So in this case, they're all covered up. I just pat them down. And then because the soil is already fully saturated, I just lightly mist the top to sort of set this light potting seed starting mix. And as you can see, it blows all over the place. So you want to moisten it down, and a spray bottle is really good for this. You really don't want to use water in this case because it will cause the seeds to float, and that's not something you want to have happen at this stage. So if you don't have a spray bottle, what you'll want to do is just pretty much leave it alone. You have enough water in the soil already. It's better not to water from the top. Now that the seed starting mix that we covered up the seeds with is good and moist, I'm going to use a commercial cover in this case to cover up the flat, and they're ready to go on the shelf. With a cover like this, you really are probably not going to have to water them again until the seeds start or sprout, and then you remove the cover. So this will trap the moisture nicely. I put it over on the shelf next to the other one that I just planted and adjust my lights if necessary. In this case, the lights are a pretty good height. With the covers, it does mean that it's higher than 2 or 3 inches, but of course we don't have anything sprouted yet, so the plants don't, that's not really a problem. What you want to make sure though is that even though these are cool lights, you want to make sure that you're not in contact with any material that could melt or catch fire. So we're good here, and now we're just going to wait until hopefully our seeds sprout. Okay, well, it's been about 7-8 days since we planted those seeds, and now it's time to take a look at what has happened and to thin them and talk about what you do with your young plants once they've sprouted. In the intervening 7 days, you'll notice that I've done some modifications, and this is growing seeds at home is always an evolving process, and this time I added space blanket. This is my it looks like a large baked potato. This is actually an idea I got from a friend of mine who did it, and the reason I put it up is because I was having some trouble with my starts, not getting quite enough lights, because as you see, I put a lot of things on my grow shelves, and I thought maybe the silver would reflect back the light, and so far it's doing a great job. Here are the beans that we planted 7 days ago, and this gives you a classic example of some of the problems you'll encounter with your grow shelves. Beans grow really fast, and these guys shot up like crazy, and they won't fit under my grow lights. If I had other plants that were as big as these, this wouldn't be a problem because I could raise up the lights to accommodate. But if I just try to accommodate these 6 plants, it's going to throw everything else off for my smaller plants. So what I'm going to do is after I thin them today, they're going to go out to the windowsills. So let's thin these. And these guys are a little bit too big. This is called legginess. When a plant shoots up bigger than it should be, this is about the normal size that it should be for this age of plant. And you can see there's a big difference here. This is because this plant was under the lights for a longer time and was getting the proper amount of light it needed to grow. These plants were further away from the light, and as a result they grow fast because they want to go towards the light. But no matter, they'll still be healthy enough when time comes. To thin them on plants that are this big, even though you could pull them up, you really don't want to do that because it's going to disturb the root system of the plant that you want to keep. So get a pair of sharp scissors. These are my good embroidery scissors, so I'm very careful to always make sure there's no dirt in the blades because it will dull them very quickly. But the sharper the scissor, the better because it makes a clean cut. And actually, I realize that's not that big of a deal because you're not going to keep this plant, but I like to have them sharp. There you go. This is just what you do to... Now these guys are not really in the center of the pot, but I'm going to keep that one. You also want to try to keep the healthiest looking plant. Again, these kind of got off-centered. In this case, I'm going to take the slightly smaller one because that's a little bit too big. Also, these beans pushed up the soil. They're a pretty vigorous plant, so I just push them back down and add a little bit of water on this one. It's dry. And these guys are going to go out to my windowsill. Here's the beans' new home in a nice sunny windowsill. But even though there's lots of light here, again, it's coming in one direction at a slant that's light's not directly overhead as it would be in the grow lights. So every day or every other day I'm going to give these plants, quarter to half rotation so that they'll grow straight. Now that the beans are in their new home on the windowsill, let's look at the flat of 6 packs that we planted last week and thin them out. Now, you see here there's a couple of things you'll notice about this. One is that there's some cells that have nothing in them at all. And this could be a cause for concern. So I'm going to look at what I planted here. And this is, these were larkspur, a type of flower. Larkspur actually can take up to 3 weeks to germinate. So that's not a problem. This is what I would expect to see. What is in this flat? These are cabbages. This is a problem because this is broccoli and these are cabbages. The broccoli is already sprouted. They're in the same family. These should have sprouted by now. So I'm not going to wait around any longer. Most likely what happened is I planted them too deep. This is unusual. You'll rarely get so many not germinating, but in this case I think probably got to plant it a little bit too deep, or even more likely is that I forgot to monitor this very closely and the flat dried out at a critical time just as the seed is sending out the young sprout. Once your seeds are to this point, if they get a little bit dry or dry out, it's not good for the plant, but it will recover if you get water on them within a reasonable amount of time. If you let it dry out when the seed is just sending out the shoot under the soil, can be just terminal. So I suspect that's what happened to the cabbage. So I'm not going to wait for those. We started them early enough and this is a variety of cabbage that is an early producer, that you can we'll plant some more and we'll have plenty. But we'll plant them this weekend. You wouldn't want to wait too much longer than that. So let's now thin these, and I'm moving these around in the flat so that when I put them back on the shelf, they'll get more light. And here, I'm going to put these to the outside edge since they haven't germinated yet. They don't need light. And we'll put these in the middle. Now we're going to thin the broccoli, and as you can see there's about 2 to 3 plants per cell. That's way too many, and we're going to just take our scissors and cut out the extra. I usually try to take ones that look the healthiest and also are in the center of the cell, because that's the best place for them to grow. You want to thin your seedlings before they get, these are the first leaves that emerge. They're not true leaves. You want to thin them before they're actually getting into their true leaves. So when they have 2 leaves, this one I've already thinned. These are marigolds. Because otherwise they're growing in just too crowded a condition, and you're not going to get them off to a healthy start. So thin them as soon as you can is best. Down to 1 plant per cell. I keep my seedlings because I feed them to my chickens. They love it. It's their fresh greens. At this time of year, they're very happy for that. This one, I must have had unsteady fingers because I've got about 4 plants in there. So I just go in and I try to gently sort out so I don't accidentally cut everything. And you always want to also handle your seedlings gently up at the leaves. Don't touch the stems. That can damage them. They're pretty fragile. I also just re-tamp down the dirt if it's kind of loose. Help them establish their root system, squeeze out all the air that might be getting in there. And now you can see they look a lot less crowded. So those are the broccoli. Now here, like this lettuce, I dropped a lot of seeds in here. So I'm just going to shave it and try to get to 1 lettuce seed. One thing here about these lettuce plants is they're what I call leggy. They have shot up a little bit too much. They're too tall for a lettuce plant. And the reason that happened is because they were probably too far away from the light, and they will, again, grow towards the light. So I am not too happy with these seedlings, but I think they'll be okay. I'm going to try to put them right under the light, give them a better source of light so that slows it down. Legginess is usually caused by not controlling your light source, because the plants grow too quickly to get closer to the light. It can also be caused by temperature in your cold weather crops like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, because your cold weather crops prefer to grow at about 55 degrees, 55 to 65, and in a home setup that's really hard to control. So if you get legginess in those crops, it's because it's too warm where you're growing it. But again, it's not a terrible problem for the home gardener. I've set out pretty leggy cabbages, and they do fine once they get out into the garden. So we'll thin up our lettuce. I also point out that lettuce is not something if you're tight on space, lettuce grows very, very quickly. And normally people direct seed it right out into the garden. I started some lettuce because I'd like to get some spring greens a little bit earlier. And this year we're having a lot of snow on the ground. So I started some indoors just to get a head start. But it grows very quickly. And like I said, if you don't have a lot of space, don't waste your grow shelves on something like lettuce. So there. That's all thinned, and now it's ready to go back onto its shelf. I'm going to take note of the orientation. You'll see that these are tending to tilt to the right, and these have some tilt to the left. Let's just move that around, and I'm going to just try to set them squarely under the lights to get rid of some of that tilt. Just like that. And I put the lettuce so it's more directly under the light, and hopefully that will help them grow a little straighter. Now, while we're talking about light, let's look at how to help control the legginess. As you'll see here, I've got a variety of plants, some that are very large. These are sunflowers. Some that are very, very small. These are some daisies, sage, and a few other slow-growing varieties. And the same here. And what I do when I have this kind of situation, you can tilt your lights by raising and lowering them. I could drop this or raise this side higher, lower this side. I also do what I find is easiest is just to set them up on things, and that way it gets elevated. This one you can see very well. the type of legginess that, or sorry, the orientation that happens with light. These are really tilting in. And this is difficult to control when it's in this type of flat because I can't rotate them around. And the only thing I can do is just turn them the other direction and hope that they will straighten up a little bit. Let's look at this flat. This is the kind of situation that is the easiest for the home gardener with the grow lights. It's with individual 6-packs, you have a lot more control of moving your plants to help them grow straight. And what I do is every day or every other day I come in and I take the ones that are on the edges and I move them into the middle of the flat. And the ones that are in the middle I move out to the edges. And I also usually rotate them 90 degrees, but you just basically what you want to do is just get the plant in a different orientation and so that it grows evenly. Otherwise you're going to get a very pulled over plant. This one has died. So I do that every day. And the reason that that your plants on the end grow like that is 2 reasons. One is you can see my grow shelf, when I orient the flats like this, which is the way I can get the most flats on the shelf, is that the ones on the end are just outside of the reach of the light. So that's a problem, and that's why I rotate them. And the other is that on fluorescent lights, the light is always dimmer at the 2 ends of the bulb. So even if you have a setup here where I have room that I can have the plants squarely under the lights, these plants on this end are not going to get as much light because they're at the end of the bulb. This is a nice healthy flat of peppers and tomatoes, but I don't really like this type of flat. It's a 1-unit thing, and I can't rotate my plants individually. So as you can see it here on this end, the tomato is really bent over, and the tomatoes on this outer edge are smaller than the tomatoes on this row. Even though they're very close to each other, just the fact that these are continually getting less light has made a difference in the height. So the only thing I can do with this kind of tray is just basically move it 180 degrees. And I'm not going to use this type of flat next year. Live and learn. Well, let's take a look at one of the more prevalent diseases that you can have hit your young starts. It's actually not a disease, it's a fungus, and it's called damping off disease. And if one day you're come in to check on your starts and you have a nice healthy flat like this, and oops, somebody is keeled over just like that overnight, this is called damping off disease. And it's a fungus that grows in the soil and it attacks right at the root stem. And what you'll often find is if you pull it up, it breaks right off at the root without any pressure at all, or right at the base of the soil. That's because there was fungus there and it attacked the tender root. The principal way to control it is not to have too moist a soil and to have air circulation. And air circulation is both not having your plants too crowded, and in this case they're not, but it was too moist, a little bit too moist. I have a fan set up that just keeps the air circulating. You can get a little fan to hang on your shelf and will actually get the air movement going closer. This is a pretty powerful fan, so it gets enough air circulation. And what you want to see is that your plants are kind of moving a little bit. This also helps strengthen them, and it will help when you set them outside, because one of the things that when you put them out to harden off or in the garden, they have to get adjusted to the fact that there's breeze, there's wind, and they need to get strong. And in here, when there's no wind motion, they're not getting this kind of motion that will help build a stronger stem. Another way to control damping off is to water from the bottom. And I know last week I had talked about that when we were planting our seedlings in terms of not disturbing the seeds, but it's also important to do it because it will help keep it from getting too wet at the soil stem interface, which is where that fungus likes to hang out. And also it helps develop stronger root system. If the plant has to draw up water from the bottom, it's going to be sending its roots down. Now, let's talk a little bit about fertilizers. I I don't often fertilize, well, I don't fertilize at this stage because I have these in potting soil. And potting soil has quite a bit of organic material in it. So these plants are small enough right now that that's giving them plenty of nutrients. They do make fertilizers especially for seed starting. And it's important to use these because if you look here, you have 3 numbers always on your fertilizers. This one is 2, 4, and 1. And this is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you look at your regular fertilizers that you might use for your bigger houseplants or vegetables once they're established in your garden, you'll see on this one it's 10, 15, and 10. This means there's 10% nitrogen, 15% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. Versus here for a starter, 2, 4, and 1. You want to have a weak fertilizer because something like this will burn the plant or cause it to grow too quickly. Always follow the instructions on the back. When it comes to fertilizing your plants, too much is never a good thing. It will kill them. Okay, with this tray back, we've pretty much now talked about everything you need to do to start seeds at home. We've gone through the whole process from your setup to the types of trays and seed cells that are good to use, the types of soil, and we planted some and then we've also thinned them. This is pretty much the process that you do for about 2 months. The earliest that you tend to start seeds is in mid-March, going through to the end of April and early May. And the process is pretty much this daily. You'll check your seeds, make sure that they're wet but not too wet. Check the level of lights, rotate your plants in the 6-pack so that the plants grow evenly. Have the fan turn on when you have large enough plants to make sure that they get some air movement, keeps the damping off disease down and helps the plants grow strong. And this is what we'll do for the next 3 to 4 weeks until our plants are large enough to start the hardening off process. And that's when we'll be starting to take them out outside, increasingly for longer periods of time. And that's a very necessary and critical step because you don't want to just put your coddled indoor seedlings that have grown in these wonderful 72 to 80 degree growing temperature and then just throw them outside in the garden. So we'll be back to talk about hardening up when we've got all our plants up to a nice healthy size. It's been several weeks since we were last here thinning and transplanting the seedlings, and as you can see they've grown quite a bit, and these aren't even the tallest that I have or the most abundant. Half of them are in another room because they no longer fit under the lights. It is also getting close to when I want to start putting them in the garden, and in order to do that I've got to start a process called hardening off, which is that you slowly acclimate these tender seedlings or the plants to being outside. When they're inside, temperature is about 80 degrees, there's lots of light, there's no wind, it's not raining on them, and if you take these that have been grown under this kind of controlled situation and put them outdoors immediately into the soil, you're going to lose most of your starts. So now that you've invested all of this time and energy in growing healthy plants, you really want to prepare them slowly for being outdoors, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we take some outside. Another thing I've had to adjust in the interim is that I realized my great plan of having wheels here to roll this whole thing out to make my life a little bit easier isn't going to work as well as I originally thought, primarily for the fact that I still have seedlings coming up, things that are too small to go outside or still need intensive light, so I still need to use my grow light at the same time that I have plants that I want to start planting next week and I want them to get outside. So I'm going to go and take these outside and do what I've been doing for the last 15 years, which is carting them in and out every night, and I'm going to go and take these outside. Well, here I am going to start hardening off these plants, and what I do when I start, I want to choose a sheltered location, something close to the house where there's not too much wind or animals that can get into the plants. A cloudy day is ideal. You might think a warm sunny day is a best day to start taking out your tender seedlings, but actually when it's cloudy, it's less stressful for the plants. The ideal hardening off schedule is about 10 days before you're going to plant them, but realistically I usually do about a week because I start hardening them off on a weekend. And the first time you put them outside, the first couple of days, you want about 2 to 4 hours. 4 hours is good. You don't want to leave them out all day, and if you're working, they're going to be out to about 8 to 10 hours. So I start on a Saturday. Saturday and Sunday I harden them off for about 4 hours every day. And then on Monday, when I have to go to work, I bring them out in the morning, make sure that they're well watered so that they won't dry out. They do tend to dry out faster outside than they do inside the house because of the air movement. And I use a floating row cover and just lightly cover them up for the day so that even though they have to be out longer, they have a little bit of protection. And a floating row cover, even though you have small seedlings, is fine for them. And I do this for about 2 days, and then I just let them go all day while I'm away at work. And they've done fine like that. The other time you'll use a row cover is after they've been hardened off for a while, say about 3 or 4 days. If the weather is not going to go down to 20 degrees at night, if you're not going to likely have a frost, I leave them out overnight. These I've started hardening off about 4 days ago. So tonight I'm going to leave them out, and I cover them up with a row cover at night so that I don't have in case there is a freak frost, I don't lose them. After all of this hard work, I really want to make sure that they make it to the garden. So in a week, next weekend, I will plant all of these out, having hardened them off for 7 days. The other thing that we should talk about before we finish is hardening them off for a greenhouse. If you have a home greenhouse or a cold frame where there's plastic over it, the plants that you are going to be planting out there, like your tomatoes and squash, after you get them used to some cooler temperatures for a few days, you're going to want to harden them off for higher temperatures. In my greenhouse during a sunny day, I can get temperatures in there up to 95 to 105 degrees. For a number of years I was losing all of my cucumbers, at least half of what I planted out, and I finally did enough research and realized it was because I wasn't hardening them off for heat. I had hardened them off for cooler temperatures, but hadn't actually put them in the greenhouse. So I do the same process. After they've been outside for a while, maybe 3 to 4 days, about 3 days before I'm going to plant them in the greenhouse, I take them down there and I put them in the greenhouse for about 2 to 4 hours at temperatures that are getting up to the 90, 100 degree level. And I keep an eye on them, and then I bring them out. So that takes a little bit of extra step, but it's well worth it because it dramatically reduces your die-off when you transplant them into the greenhouse. So this is the process where I've got now, you've seen it go from little seeds to full-size plants that are ready to be planted and get into their final home for the summer. We've gone through what kind of soil to use, how to thin your plants, transplant them into other containers, and this final step of bringing them outside and slowly getting them acclimated to outdoor conditions. If you have any questions about this, you can talk to your local cooperative extension service, and they'd be more than happy to help you with it. But as you see, it's a pretty easy process. You've just got to be flexible. Expect to lose a few plants here and there. I've lose a few throughout each time, but generally if you follow these steps and have fun doing it, you will have lots of healthy plants for your garden and lots of good vegetables to eat and flowers to pick.